Welcome to Peacemakers, an interview-style podcast where you'll hear and learn from world changers, ministry leaders, creatives, and many others who are influencing change and bringing peace to those around them. We're so excited that you're tuning in. Here's your host, Jonathan Moya.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Peacemakers. I am super excited about today's conversation. Today's guest is Kitti Murray. Kitti serves as the founder and CEO of Refuge Coffee Company. Refuge Coffee was born in the heart of Clarkston, a holy and unique pocket of the metro Atlanta area with more than 45 countries and 65 languages represented within its city limits. Kitti launched her business in 2015 with the desire to build community and support her refugee neighbors as they found refuge both in the United States and in God Himself. Refuge Coffee offers on-the-job training, including living wages and full-time hours to local refugees. Kitti, I am so glad to welcome you to today's podcast. How are you?
I am great, and I'm even greater talking to you. This is quite the honor. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I have learned about your work. I have followed a bit about your life in the last few years. I know that there's a lot of things that I can talk to you about today, but we have a short amount of time. I'm excited to hear about this Refuge Coffee Company and then also a little bit about the work that you're doing in community building, supporting refugees and your immigrant neighbors in the place that you call home.
I'm excited to do also, and I love the work that you do, but I feel like we're kindred spirits.
Before we dive more deep into the conversation, I like to start by having our guests share about their upbringing, share about those early years that I think connect to who we are today. What shapes our passions? What shapes our vision for the life that we live and the work that we do? Can you start sharing a little bit about your upbringing with us?
I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. My grandfathers on both sides were pastors. The grandfather that lived in Nashville that I was closest to eventually left pastoring and started a magazine called Home Life. That tells you a lot about him. He was very family oriented. I really think I grew up an idyllic home in a lot of ways. If any of your listeners know the Enneagram, I'm an Enneagram 7. So I tend to reframe all my stories in this happy, positive way that is sometimes really great and sometimes not so great. But I do think on the whole, my childhood, the time in my home, I had my parents were great. I really did have a sweet childhood. I learned early on about Jesus. I didn't really care about him very much, but I learned about him early on. I grew up in the time, I'm 67, so I was born in 1956. And as I've gotten older and looked back at the history of our country during that time, I realized that there was a racial and economic divide, just as there is today. And of course, I'm looking back on it, and I would call it privilege. I've learned to not see privilege as this horrible thing because until I was an adult, I didn't have a lot of control over that. But I do know I was given a sense of security and being welcomed in almost any room I walked into. And education, my parents paid for me to go to college. My husband and I couldn't even do that for our children, but that was how life was, and it's all I knew. My past and my childhood were great, and I'm grateful for it. But I have also had to wrestle with, all right, so what do I do with that now? In not a shameful way, although I'm sure there are times I've felt that, but more in this is a gift I have, and I know I'm supposed to give it away. So how do I do that? And how do I be grateful for it, but still give it away?
I love that you bring us back to that part of your life. I am also an Enneagram 7. I can totally relate to how you're describing the way your mind works and the way that we rephrase situation. One of the questions that I like to ask is, how was faith a part of your growing up? What role did faith play in your family, in your life?
I grew up in a church that was a sweet church. But I think everything about Jesus felt very muted to me. I used to say, oh, I didn't even hear the gospel there. And that is not true. I think my ears didn't hear it. As a 16-year-old, I heard this basic idea that about who Jesus was and what he did for me, and that I needed to respond to him. My heart was primed and ready, and so I did. This is during the Jesus movement. I was never a flower child or any of that stuff, but I think I wanted to be. So I had this Bible that was called The Way, and I remember picking it up the day after I basically told Jesus I wanted to follow him. And I read it because I just wanted to. And I remember going downstairs and telling my mom, did you know this? It was something that was in the Gospels in the New Testament. And my mom looked at me funny. I know not everybody has that kind of black and white Damascus Road kind of experience, but I did. It was a game changer from day one. Becoming a Christian looks different for a lot of people. And I'm in a more liturgical setting now where there's a formalized element to it sometimes. But I love the verse, as you have received Christ Jesus, so walk in him. I think there's just been a continual walk of, oh, that's who you are, Jesus. And oh, this is who I am. And as much as I understood of him, I gave as much as I knew of myself as a 16-year-old. But that continual journey has been a part of my life ever since. And I was so blessed to meet a man who was on the same journey and who had a similar experience in a different city. When we began our journey together, that's what we did. We used to laugh and look back and go, oh gosh, we thought we knew everything and we knew nothing. And we were insufferable know-it-alls. The journey is what has been so beautiful.
You talked about your experience in the context of your upbringing, the experience of faith in the context of your surroundings. Some of the references that you make, vaguely familiar with, because I am a child of the 80s. Our experiences have been different, but I love the part where you shared about how it's also walking in that journey with someone else that can help you see a different expression of what you're learning and what you're going through in life. You and your husband met, both of you were from different places, but somehow ended up in the Clarkston, Georgia area.
Ended up in Atlanta. He's from Atlanta. He was here going to college. I was in college, different school. And we met through a mutual friend. And the funny thing is, this just says a lot about me. I had told my parents, there is no way I'm going to get married when I am 21. I am not going to college to find a husband. I am a complete human being and God meets all my needs and I don't need blah, blah, blah. So I pontificated a lot back then. And then I met my husband. And when I was 20 and got married when I was 21 and was so sure and remained sure that he was it for me. I remember I was speaking to a group of college students years ago, and one of them said afterwards, how do you feel about the fact that you disobeyed God? And I was like, what? I did not disobey God. I disobeyed myself. That was my vision of what my life was supposed to be like. Bill would say it this way later in life. All I want to do is tell people about the goodness of God. Mm-hmm. And in that season, for him, especially, the penultimate way to do that was to become a pastor. And so that's what he did. We went off to seminary together. While we were engaged, he had cancer. And so halfway through our year-long engagement, he had a cancer diagnosis. It was Hodgkin's disease, and he had radiation. This was the second year, I think, that radiation was even used for this purpose. And it wasn't like it is today. 15 years later, he had a massive heart attack. I would always say, if you almost die again, I'm going to kill you. It's so hard. And yet he did almost die a bunch. But all that to say, he was a pastor for 30 years. Then he stepped out of a pastor role, did other things. Then we lived in Texas for seminary, 5 years in Pennsylvania. But most of our time was here in Atlanta, which was home for him and has become home for me. Clarkston is a part of Atlanta. If they've only heard about it on the news or something, they think of it as far away from here or a small town, but it's really urban and a part of Atlanta.
How did you end up in the suburbs of Atlanta, working around diverse populations? And how did that realization come to both of you?
I am not reframing this. This is exactly how it happened. Bill left the pastor role. He was working for a nonprofit. I was a writer at that time and doing that pretty much full time. Our children were all grown, 4 boys. The youngest was in college. So we had moved into some apartments downtown in Atlanta, and we loved what we did. We were there for 2 years, and it was a 2-year commitment. But towards the end of the second year, we both loved it so much, we just decided to add another year and stay longer. During that year, we knew that we would need to eventually leave, and that the wisest thing to do would be to buy a house again. We had sold the last house where we'd had the whole family, and we had downsized. It was exhilarating. We got rid of a lot of stuff. We went down to 1 car, and we just enjoyed living downtown and walking a lot of places, but also we loved what we did. Bill had been asked to teach a class on biblical social justice at a seminary nearby. And the class ended up, there were some scheduling conflicts. It never happened, but he did the study. And so one night we're eating dinner, and he goes, "Kitti, there's something in the Bible that is bothering me." And the reason that statement's such a big deal is, one, he had a PhD in theology. He knew the Bible. So for it to really arrest him like that had to be a big deal. And then the second thing is that he was never bothered. I live bothered. He was the opposite. And I perked up, and he said, "We both know that the Bible talks about widows, aliens, orphans, and the poor." And he goes, "Why don't we have any friends that fit that description?" I reacted defensively, I hate to say, but it didn't last long. I was like, "Sure, we have friends. We went on this mission trip. We give this money, done this project." And we lived in an area of town where it was easy to get close to people that were struggling in ways that we didn't struggle. Anyway, so he pushed back. And by the time the night was over, we had made a decision that we would move somewhere in Atlanta to be in proximity to widows, aliens, orphans, and the poor, people who were not like us, and so that we could be neighbors and actually build friendships. And we had no idea what that meant, and we had no idea where that was. Cities are fluid places. The places that one decade would describe them, the next decade might not. That night, I remember we said, "Okay, God, this is what we want to do, and you'll have to show us where." The cool thing is, we had some time to think it through, so it wasn't like this pressing, urgent thing. 2 weeks later, I went out to lunch with a good friend of mine that I hadn't seen in 6 months. She was one of those friends that when we were in community together, we were close, and then we were still close, but just didn't see each other as often. And she and her husband at that time lived in Dunwoody, another part of Atlanta. And I knew that they had been thinking of buying some property in Clarkston, which is home to the refugee resettlement community. We knew about Clarkston. For some reason, it wasn't on our radar, but I said, "Hey, did you buy that property?" They were going to buy it and donate it to their church. And she said, "No, that fell through, but we bought a neighborhood instead." And I was like, "What?" And then she said, just joking, she goes, "Do you want to buy one of our houses?" And I said, "Yes, we do." So 6 months later, we moved here, and that was 12 years ago. We told our kids, "We're buying our last house. Like, you're going to have to move us out of this one. This is where we are landing." And as a pastor, Bill, and we'd never been 100% sure we'd stay in the same place forever. We were old enough by then that forever wasn't really that long. We moved here with no intention of starting anything, of changing jobs. We were going to keep our day job, and we were going to get to know our neighbors and love them like Jesus told us to. And we literally did not know what the next steps would be.
Thank you for walking me through that journey. Even though I have followed some of your work, this really takes us deep into some of that intricacy of decision making and even trying to discern how to live life more intentional. So you bought a house in Clarkston. It's one of the most diverse square miles in the entire nation. There's a lot of ethnicities. How was life early on with Clarkston for you?
I think we knew what we were walking into. Like we knew we had done some volunteering with World Relief way back with a family from the Congo, and we'd gotten to know them. That was like every other week coming over for a few hours to tutor the kids in school. Like it was very minimal. And there's nothing wrong with that. I applaud people who do that all day long. It's also very disruptive because Atlanta's a big city, and to drive anywhere other than your neighborhood is just a thing. Here's what happened. We moved in. Bill said something so wise. He said, let's just get to know people. Let's don't jump on board at some organization until we've really gotten to know the neighborhood. That was big. And that was hard for me. Again, I pushed back a little because I was like, no. But I'm so glad we did that because it created breathing room for us to get to know people. One of the women in the neighborhood who I'd known years and years before brought over her friend, Amina. Amina at the time was in her 80s. She's from Somalia. We had boxes in our living room, but we sat around with her and had tea, and she told us her whole story, which I can't tell here, but I can tell you a little part of it. She became a Christian in Somalia, which is punishable by death, and she fled to Ethiopia. Her husband eventually followed her. They had 10 children, and when their youngest children, who were 14-year-old twins, and so her father-in-law died. They went back to Somalia thinking they could safely go back for her father-in-law's funeral. And rebels came and murdered everyone the day after the funeral. And Amina was left for dead. And when the Red Cross came to bury bodies, they discovered Amina had a pulse. It's really a typical refugee journey. It's years of she went to Burundi, and then she was in a camp in Kenya. And then I think it was 3 or 4 years before we moved here, she was placed in Clarkston. Everybody has some form of violence and are unwelcomed in their home countries in violent ways. I went to bed that night and I was like, oh Lord, I want to be her friend. And that feels very weird and opportunistic. Like I knew that wasn't the way to go about this, to just charge in and say, let's be friends. So getting to know everybody, she would take us to people's homes. We would meet in our home. We just got to know the neighborhood, and we got to know all the other people who live here in Clarkston, which is just a mishmash of lots of different people.
Proximity brought you into friendships. It exposed a depth of the community that now you're living in. For better or for worse, you get to celebrate in the celebrations, but you also get to face the difficulties of what it means to live in community with people. When I think about people from different nations or cultures, I think a lot about community, the importance of family, the importance of living in community. And so we share a lot of our burdens. How did that open your eyes to maybe some of the things that you're doing now with Refuge Coffee Company? Your move there was intentional, but you saw some things that maybe brought forward some dreams, some conversations, some visions. And what happened over the years with that?
I always tell people these conversations in my head started, and I kept them mostly to myself. I would talk to my husband about it, but the 3 kind of conversation loops that started. So the first one was very selfish. I was a writer. I love coffee shops and I love coffee, and there wasn't one nearby. You had to go to Decatur, which is not very far, but it's still just a totally different ecosystem. And there just wasn't anything here. And I sure wish there was a coffee shop I could ride my bike or walk to.
Yeah.
So that's one. And now there are several coffee shops, but at the time there were not. So then second thing was, and I think this is probably the most compelling thing that happened. And it's just that I fell in love with people here, with individuals, but also with this mashup of cultures and heroic people, resilient people. I'm a natural networker, and I wanted everybody that I'd known before I moved here to meet all the people I knew here. That was such a strong impulse. So the idea of a coffee shop where the worlds could come together. I probably didn't realize how hard it would be to make that happen and to not just create this place for all the white people I knew to hang out and feel good about themselves. That's not what I wanted. I needed to have a lot of trust in them as well, I think. But this idea of, proximity has taught me so much and made me a different person. What if I gave people that gift of proximity? And then the third thing, if you care about a community, then the pain points of that community become yours. And the thing I kept hearing over and over was, we just need more industry here. We need jobs that are close. The first job that a refugee gets is almost never their best job. But the first job for most refugees, I think this is probably still the case, is an hour and a half away in one of the chicken processing plants. And those aren't terrible, evil places necessarily, but they're also not a place where someone who needs to learn English spend 3 hours every day just in the commute. You have to pay for the commute. You can't learn English on the job. And so the idea that, if we had a coffee shop here, we could employ a few people and give them a job. Everything about it felt like a tiny drop in a huge bucket and a little fluffy. Is this really what this community needs? Because don't we need more doctors? Don't we need more mental health care? Don't we need more food and clothes and all the things? I knew in my gut that we needed a place that didn't have an agenda, that people could feel safe in, and that people needed jobs, and that we needed to pay a competitive wage job. So we pay well because we want people to have a year and a half or a year to breathe and to dream and to plan for their future.
Your mission at Refuge Coffee Company is to use a delicious cup of coffee as a platform for job training and personal development of resettled refugees and other immigrants. I know that the mission sometimes is high level for some people to understand. What does Refuge Coffee Company look like for people who maybe have never been to the Atlanta area who are just learning about this?
We have a shop in Clarkston that is just by the grace of God. We chose a place that ended up becoming available for us to buy at a time where, amazingly, we were able to buy it. So it's right in the middle of town. It's an old gas station. It's a de facto town center. There are other places here to gather, but this is the one place that's the retail coffee shop. Anybody can show up and be here. It's a pretty large space for a coffee shop. So it enables us to do events and a lot of things for the community. So that's what happens here. And I would say downstream from that mission of employing people is to create this inviting, welcoming, agendaless space. And Clarkston is where I feel like we do it best. And the other is just to tell the world a better refugee story, the true story that I think is really beautiful. We do have 3 other shops in town. Every one of them is a little different, and they're great.
It's fascinating to hear the founding story and kind of your initial vision. I bet that hasn't come with a little challenge. You also mentioned you don't have that personality of starting something new. I can relate a lot because what Border Perspective is, what this podcast is, the work that we're doing now at the U.S.-Mexico border was never in my wheelhouse. What for me started as a project, now as a nonprofit, and you saw needs in your community, you saw potential, and so you started Refuge. What have been some of those challenges?
At the beginning, I used to say we had an identity crisis a day. What are we? Because we had a physical space and because we are a nonprofit as well, people would come and dump furniture and clothes, and we'd be like, what are we supposed to do with this? I don't know. And not that it was bad, but we didn't know what to do with that. So we had to decide. We are a job training program. At the end of the day, that is our identity. But we're also a coffee shop, and all the good things coffee shops do for communities, we can do that exponentially because we're a nonprofit. And so people can give money to us because coffee shops don't really make that much money. We also made the decision to pay well. I have a pet peeve about nonprofits that make the people they serve bear all of the risk. If you really plan to serve people, don't make them sacrifice for what you're doing. So we made a decision early on that we would pay well and we would do what it takes to pay well. I would take pay cuts when I needed to. We just made that decision early on. I thought naively that once we raised money at the beginning, I would never have to talk about money again. Talking about money and talking about donor stuff creates relationships with generous people. And they get to be a part of what we're doing, and I get to invite them to be a part. One reason to not be a nonprofit, to be for-profit, I didn't want to owe people money. Like that just sounded scary to me. Bill and I had been in ministry forever. We'd raised support many times over the years. We didn't have the cushion to just do this without an influx of cash. The thought of having investors that I had to pay back was really scary to me. What I have realized is, no, we do have to pay people back, but we pay them back in doing what we said we were going to do with their money. So I think that whole part of it, just getting comfortable with having to have those conversations and knowing that we have built this thing that is bigger than we have the capacity to handle. Therefore, everybody on our staff is like, their plates are overloaded. And we want that to change. But I also think I want our mission to outreach our capacity from time to time, or maybe all the time. Our one word mission is the word welcome. How do we do welcome? How do we do it when during the pandemic, when people hang out at our spot in town and yet they can't? And so we have next to the sign that has welcome in a ton of languages, we have a sign that says, get your coffee and get out. This idea of welcome is incredibly nuanced and it is incredibly hard. I think people who say those kinds of things are easy haven't really done it. They've just talked about it. Getting our team, our culture of our entire group being one of welcome. And we've had some seasons where it wasn't. I just love imagery, but I don't know if you've seen this National Geographic video that just came out, and it's a bunch of emperor penguins, and they're jumping off a huge iceberg cliff. It is so amazing, and there are hundreds of them. And you watch it, and the first one, and I'm sure a little of this is how they edited and music and that kind of stuff, but I think about that first penguin who jumps. They're babies. They're also babies. And they jump into the water to find food. It looks like he slides and then there's the moment of no return. I think that the exhilaration and the joy of doing something that is hard and yet involves people that you love dearly and love you back. I'm just trying to be like a penguin. Sometimes we're supposed to jump first.
For a number of years, especially with engaging work in a polarizing space, which you also understand, I was waiting for somebody else to do what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Then I realized nobody was stepping forth, and it wasn't that I wanted to step forth either, but I think it was taking that risk. It was finding that boldness and that trust, even though it has been some of the more difficult spaces that I've engaged in. I also often say that it is one of the most rewarding.
Absolutely.
What have been some events or initiatives within Refuge that have particularly been successful in, I would say, bridge building? Because as you talk about connecting a majority population with a minority, ethnically diverse population, what have been those successes for you?
I can tell so many great stories about that because that's what I choose to look at. There was some violence in the Muslim world that was accredited to Muslims. The rhetoric around Muslims got really hateful. A friend of mine who's a cardiologist, Dr. Haval Kelly, called me one day and he goes, "Hey, Kitti, I don't know if you know this, but for the first time in 40 years, the White House is not hosting an iftar dinner. And iftar is the night every night during Ramadan, when Muslims break their fast. So it's at sundown, it's a party. He asked me, could we host an iftar dinner at Refuge? He goes, my community, we're not mad, but we're hurt. We're just hurt. And I went to our little staff. This was 2017, I think, right after the Paris bombings, not long after. I went to them and I said, hey, there's only really one date that's going to work, because it was towards the end of Ramadan. And it was a Saturday night, but that day we were hosting World Refugee Day along with a coalition that's here. But we were hosting, which is a big lift for our whole team. And I said, I hate even asking you this, but how do you feel about this? And everyone said, how can we not do this? And so we did it with a bunch of other people. There's a video online of that first one that is so beautiful. So we just hosted. Christians were there, Jews were there, other groups were there. And then our Muslim community came. The imam came and did the call to prayer. So we set off a part of our parking lot for them to put prayer rugs out. And I remember I'm a older Christian woman, and I thought, oh, am I crossing a line? And Refuge, we are faith adjacent. We're not faith based. That's another big decision we had to make. Several hundred people came. My husband, I remember he put his arms around me and he goes, is this what you pictured when you started Refuge? And I went, oh my gosh, it's so much better. Because it was just we were saying, I love you to our community. And it was a potluck and people brought food, and it was just such a moment. And I feel like we've had a lot of those moments at Refuge, and basically we just get to host them. We just get to be there to bear witness. Our small community, it's a microcosm of the whole world. My thing is, if it can work here, it can work anywhere.
I love that story. I love what happens when we lean in, and I love what happens when we decide to take a little bit of that risk. Maybe the vision for Refuge came from within, but the people that are helping execute it are making it even better. And that's what I hear from you as well.
Yes. Yeah. I showed up we had a 9th birthday party on Saturday morning. We did a dance party because our whole team, we love to dance, and it was great. But I walked up there from my house and I went, they don't need me here today. Not that Refuge doesn't need me. I hope we get to that place, but there's so many times where beautiful, amazing things happen, and I'm just there for it.
So you have a location in Clarkston, Georgia. You have a Midtown location in Atlanta. And then do you have a third location as well?
And Midtown, for people who don't know, it's actually at the Woodruff Arts Center, which is where our High Museum, the Alliance Theater, and others, and then our symphony, they're all there. And so just such a great place to be. It's beautiful. We're so grateful. We have a space in downtown Norcross, which is new. We opened it in November, and it's doing well. We're still figuring out, so who do we need to be here? And then we also have a place at a co-work space. It's not a retail shop. It is just the networking that people who come work with us get to do. And we couldn't do that.
Yeah.
But the communities do that.
I love how the various spaces are contextualized through the people that are leading it, the people that you're in partnership with and collaborating with. That's beautiful to hear. I want to get a little bit more personal in this conversation. Okay. This next part of the conversation will highlight this theme of grief. And that is something that I think we both share in different ways. I know you recently lost your husband, Bill.
Yeah.
And I'm very sorry. I have read many of your reflections on Instagram, and they're beautiful and they are bittersweet and they make me tear up. I too, on April 10th of 2021, lost my father in a tragic accident. And I know that coping with profound loss is difficult. So I wanted to ask, what has been your source of strength during this time? I know that your work keeps you attentive to a mission and a vision that is rewarding, but how do you navigate that in this time?
Yeah, good questions. It's been a year and a month or so, so it's different now than it was a year ago. Thankfully, our team at Refuge, our community, and my family really, and our board stepped in, and I was able to almost completely take off 3 months, maybe even more. And I thought about that a lot. I don't know what I did during that time. I remember it as a time of lots of weeping and a lot of time with family and a lot of storytelling with people. And it was a time where I did not feel responsible for Refuge. And that was fine because other people were and did it so well. I remember we buried Bill in a private, small ceremony. We did this natural burial that's across from a monastery not far from here. And I remember that morning, I had this conversation with God over and over, but I was like, God, I can't do this. Like, I can barely walk. How am I going to go and be with people? And every time I felt like the Lord said to me, and I know these are hard things to share and sound a little fluffy, but I really felt like God said to me, but you've never been able to do anything. Not in a shameful, you're terrible way, but in a, no, you've always laid yourself down before me and told me you need me. That's where strength comes from. And that is absolutely true. People tell me I'm strong, and inwardly I laugh. And I know I am in a lot of ways, but I think that's why. I think I'm more than willing to look at my own helplessness. Then we had a service. We had it at Agnes Scott College where I went and where Bill and I, we dated there. We used to call it the Bill and Kitti Murray Romance Museum because we'd take grandkids and show them, here's the porch swing where we had our first kiss, and they'd go, ew. But we just love to tell the story of all of that. And I remember the kids saying, you're going to be surprised at how many people are here. And I was like, but 1,000 people came. And Bill was never a flashy leader. He never led a big church. He always led more community-focused relational churches. But the impact of his life on so many people, and so many people here in this community, but also beyond. Now that I look back, I'm so grateful that we did that way and that people were able to come. And then we had a reception at Refuge, and it was exhausting, but also I felt, as an extrovert, I felt very lifted up by people, even though I feel like I was in a trance. Then we had our 5K that we have every year, and our team said, hey, we're going to do armbands, and everybody's going to have one, and they're in honor of Bill. And we have this great picture of lots of people holding their arms up with the armbands. It was just so, like, other people have honored him so beautifully. He would be very embarrassed by that, but I love it for him. And gosh, I didn't think I'd get emotional. He was I don't know if you've ever read Bob Goff, but his wife says, Bob's a balloon and I'm the string. Well, Bill was the string in the most beautiful way. I still haven't quite figured out how to be grounded now. And I'm grateful for the people in my life who are so grounded and who are nobody. And again, our sevenness, right? We don't want to be the downer who always talks about sad stuff. I just really don't want to be that. And yet I have loved how easily I've been able to do that. People are willing to hear it. Just one example, not long ago, during COVID, we had a free fridge, and it was a walk up, get food kind of deal at Refuge. And over time, it became a problem in the community, but not for the longest time. It met a need. You know how that happens sometimes, something that's so great and we need, all of a sudden, we don't need it, and it becomes problematic. There was a man who had moved here from Afghanistan, and he had a ton of kids. I want to say 10 kids, but Bill and I had gone to see them a few times. He came to the food pantry all the time. He barely spoke any English, so it was so hard to tell him that the food wasn't going to be there anymore. So we took stuff to them. And then that winter, I remember asking Bill, where have you been? And he goes, oh, I went to Walmart. And I was like, Walmart? And he goes, and he had bought blankets for them and taken them to their family. Bill was just quietly doing the right thing all the time without any fanfare. Refuge feels like it's just built on fanfare because we have a brand and all that kind of stuff. I ran into that guy a long time after Bill died, and had to get one of our employees who speaks Pashto like he does to come over and tell him that Bill had died. And he just stood there with his hands on his face and wept. So this is a community of people who know how to grieve. And I think during the pandemic, I learned not to compare hard or suffering. Like, you just don't compare it. It's nobody made anybody feel bad for worrying about toilet paper here. I found myself going, oh, we're so privileged and such babies. And there's some of that, but there was no, oh, shame on you for being sad about that. Nobody said to me, I lost my husband and I lost my daughter and my parents. No, they came and sat with me and wailed in my house with me, like, because everybody grieves differently. So figuring out how to grieve with people. And one of our employees had a really tragic accident happen with her 10-year-old daughter. And we went and just laid on the floor with her. But one of our employees, who's not from the same country, but also from Africa, just looked at everybody and said, hey, please tell us what your culture is. How do you grieve? And how can we help? And I just love that. Just this, we're not going to shame each other or compare. We're just going to love each other and be there for each other. And I have been the recipient of that almost every day Bill died. And it's a beautiful thing.
Thanks for sharing that. Grief can be a roller coaster ride. I think sometimes the things that maybe worry us are the things that people appreciate too. And I think sometimes even in the not knowing what to say, we give people words. And I often tell people, it's okay for you to not know what to say because I don't know what to say. As you're sharing about grief, in my story, on April 7th of this year, we actually just completed the renovation of the physical space where my dad had this tragic accident. And so it was a really wholesome moment. It was a moment that came full circle. You and Bill walked this vision, this dream together. And so how has taken on and continuing in this vision, knowing that, yes, our person, for me, it's my father, for you, it's Bill, your husband, they're not with us physically, but how does this provide you a sense of healing during your grief? And how does it encourage you time and time again?
So first, congratulations on completing renovation, because that sounds easy and I know it wasn't.
It was a 4-year process.
Yeah.
Yes, it was not easy.
No, I actually think a function of privilege is momentum. Like, we move too fast and we end up hurting people when we do that. So I'm going to co-opt Bill here a little and just say 2 things I've just thought of. First, Bill was the best listener, question asker I've ever known. I am not great at that. I'm learning, and I learned from him. When our boys were teenagers, he used to say, you don't listen to understand, you listen to reload. Because I was like, you're so right. So it is not in my nature. We had the Welcome Co-op and the State Department came and did a whole thing about sponsoring this idea that you can actually sponsor somebody. They don't have to go through a resettlement agency. It was really a cool night. We invited people and talked about it. And I was just the MC. I remember sitting there thinking, oh, I'm playing Bill's role right now. I'm asking questions and I'm not saying very much, but I'm just listening and helping people to hear. And I just pictured him in the crowd beaming at me like, yes, girl, you got it. Because that isn't me. And yet sometimes that's what's called for. That's a small thing. The other thing, we grew a lot over the last few years. And some of that growth was dysfunctional growth. Last year, even with Bill here, there's a long story behind that. But we did a lot of repairs in our culture and where we were headed. But then last year was a year to gather our strength. And then also with Bill being gone. And then I ended up having cancer after he died. So all that, I was out of it. This year, this is the goal that our entire team has embraced, is that we're going to stay on mission by building stability in a culture of learning. We're really not doing any sexy new things this year. We're refurbishing our catering operation, which is cool, but it isn't like building something new. I tend to be a what's the next big thing person. I'm learning not to be, and I'm learning how you can drag an organization over a cliff in a bad way if you just do too much of that. I said this in a poem that I posted, that when people say, oh, he's here, I want to smack them because he isn't here. And what I feel the most is his absence. And yet, so much of what I learned from him, what our community and the people at Refuge who knew him and interacted with him learned, was this intentional, slow, taking stock of everybody and listening way of doing life. So I love that we're building stability. We're not building a new thing. I love that our whole team is absolutely. Bill was a coach. He did tons of coaching the last few years of his life. So I've asked every member of our team to have a mentor this year, like our support staff, because that's this culture of learning. My favorite way to learn is from other people who know more than I do. I like to read. I think research is great, but my favorite thing is to sit down and have coffee with somebody and listen to what they have to say that I need to hear. Bill modeled that to me and to our community in this great way.
Kitti, thank you so much for opening a little bit of your heart to us. Appreciated your time with us.
Jonathan, I thank you, and I thank you for the work you do, and I acknowledge the grief that's in it, but it also just seems like such a sweet place to be.
Yes.
And I'm glad you're there.
Yes. Thank you so much again. For those of you listening, you can find out more about Refuge Coffee Company on Twitter and Instagram. You can also check out their website at refugecoffeeco.com. Again, Kitti, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening. If there was anything that stood out to you from this conversation, we'll post links about it in our show notes. So make sure to check those out. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Peacemakers. Wherever you subscribe to podcasts, go ahead and hit subscribe. Please leave us a positive review on iTunes and share this episode with your friends through Instagram stories on Spotify. And most importantly, don't forget to join us for our next exciting episode. Peacemakers Podcast is made possible by Border Perspective. Border Perspective partners with ministry leaders and organizations to host conversations on social and biblical issues that help equip the church to love our neighbor the way God intended. You can also join Border Perspective on a service learning trip along the southern border. These trips are immersive, educational, and intentionally place you into the lives of immigrant leaders serving families on the South Texas and Mexico border. To learn more about how you can join Border Perspective's peacemaking mission, visit borderperspective.org.